The rusty gate creaked as I pushed it open, my heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape. Behind me, the reformatory van was already disappearing down the dirt road, leaving nothing but dust and the echo of my own ragged breathing. 20 years old and completely alone, clutching a crumpled letter that had changed everything. The letter that brought me here, to this place I never knew existed, carrying a name I thought meant nothing. Patel. My name. Our name. And there, carved into the weathered wooden sign hanging crooked on the fence post, were those same 5 letters that had haunted me since childhood. Patel Ranch. Established 1947. I walked toward the main house, my legs shaking with each step. The place looked like it had been abandoned for years. Paint peeling off the shutters, porch steps sagging under the weight of neglect, weeds growing through the floorboards. But it was mine. According to the letter from some lawyer named Philip Mitchell, it was all mine. The house, the land, the stables, everything. Left to me by someone named Henry Price, who the letter claimed was my grandfather. A grandfather I never knew existed. The stable doors stood slightly ajar, and something inside me pulled toward them. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe desperation, but I found myself walking across the overgrown yard, past rusted farm equipment and broken fence posts. The smell hit me first. Not the fresh scent of hay and horses I expected, but something else. Something that made my stomach drop and my hands start trembling all over again. I pushed open the stable door, and that is when I saw him. A man, maybe 50 years old, hanging from the center beam. His face was purple, his body perfectly still. A wooden crate lay overturned beneath his feet, and scattered around it were dozens of photographs. Pictures of people I did not recognize, but somehow felt connected to. And there, pinned to his shirt, was a note written in shaky handwriting. Stephen Patel, I am sorry. I could not let them take it away from you too. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. This story gets darker before it gets lighter, and you will not believe what I found in those photographs. But let me back up. Let me tell you how a kid who spent his entire life bouncing between foster homes and juvenile facilities ended up standing in a stable, staring at a dead man who somehow knew my name. Let me tell you about the 3 months that changed everything I thought I knew about family, about belonging, and about the power of a name. 3 months earlier, I was sitting in the common room of Riverside Youth Reformatory, counting down the days until my release. 20 years old, which meant I was aging out of the system whether they liked it or not. I had been in and out of foster homes since I was 7, when my mom died of an overdose, and no relatives stepped forward to claim me. The state became my parent, and institutions became my home. Riverside was my 4th reformatory, and hopefully my last. I was not a bad kid exactly, just angry. Angry at a world that seemed designed to remind me every single day that I did not belong anywhere, that I was disposable, unwanted, a file number in a system that moved kids around like chess pieces. The anger got me in trouble sometimes, fighting mostly, never anything serious enough to land me in real prison, but serious enough to keep me locked up until I turned 20. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late September. I remember because it was pancake day in the cafeteria, and I was actually looking forward to breakfast for once. The guard, a decent guy named George Castillo, handed it to me with a strange expression on his face. Stephen Patel, it said on the outside. Riverside Youth Reformatory. The return address was from some law firm in a town called Cedar Falls, about 200 miles from where I was sitting. I had never heard of Cedar Falls. I had never heard of Philip Mitchell, attorney at law, and I definitely had never expected to receive a letter that would turn my entire world upside down. I opened it in my bunk that night, after lights out, using the small flashlight I had traded cigarettes for. The letter was typed on official letterhead, very formal and legal sounding, but the words inside made no sense at all. Dear Mr. Patel, it began, I am writing to inform you of the recent passing of Henry Price, who has left you a substantial inheritance in his will. Mr. Price claimed to be your maternal grandfather and has left you his property in Cedar Falls, including a ranch house, 120 acres of farmland, and all associated buildings and equipment. Please contact my office at your earliest convenience to discuss the details of this inheritance and arrange for transfer of ownership. I read that letter probably 50 times that night. Henry Price, maternal grandfather. The state had told me my mother had no family, that she was alone in the world, just like I was. They had told me there was nobody to take me in, nobody who wanted me, nobody who even knew I existed. And now this lawyer was telling me that I had a grandfather. Had a grandfather, past tense. Because he was dead now, and I would never get the chance to ask him why he never came for me. Why he let me grow up thinking I was completely alone. I spent the next 2 weeks trying to process what this meant. I called the lawyer from the payphone in the common room using quarters I had saved up from my job in the reformatory kitchen. Philip Mitchell sounded tired but kind. He explained that Henry Price had been searching for me for years, ever since my mother died. He had finally tracked me down through some private investigator, only to die of a heart attack 2 weeks later. The man had left everything to me, including a letter he had written but never had the chance to send. The inheritance was real. The property was real. And in 3 days, when I turned 20 and aged out of the system, I would be free to claim it. Free to claim a life I never knew was possible. Those 3 days felt like 3 years. I barely slept, barely ate. I kept thinking this had to be some kind of mistake, that someone would realize they had the wrong Stephen Patel and take it all back. But the paperwork was legitimate. The lawyer was legitimate. And on the morning of my 20th birthday, I walked out of Riverside Youth Reformatory carrying everything I owned in a single duffel bag and a bus ticket to Cedar Falls. The bus ride took 6 hours. 6 hours of staring out the window at farmland and small towns, wondering what I was walking into. The letter from my grandfather was in my pocket, still unopened. Philip Mitchell had given it to me during our phone call, said it was waiting for me at his office, but I was not ready to read it yet. I was not ready to hear from a man who had let me grow up alone, no matter what his reasons were. Cedar Falls was smaller than I expected. Population 3,012 according to the sign at the town limits. Main Street looked like something out of an old movie, with brick buildings and antique streetlights and American flags hanging from every storefront. People moved slower here. They made eye contact. They nodded when you walked past. It was nothing like the cities where I had grown up. Nothing like the concrete and chaos I was used to. Philip Mitchell's office was above the hardware store on Main Street. The man himself was in his 60s, with gray hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He looked like someone's grandfather, which made me think about the grandfather I would never meet. He had all the paperwork ready for me, deed transfers and bank account information and keys to the property. But first he handed me the letter. It was written on plain notebook paper in careful handwriting. The ink was blue, and some of the words were smudged like the writer's hand had been shaking. I sat in Philip Mitchell's office and read the words my grandfather had written for me, words he never got to say in person. "Stephen," it began, "I do not know if I will ever find you or if you will ever read this letter, but I have to try. I have to tell you how sorry I am. How sorry I am that I was not there when your mother died. How sorry I am that you grew up alone. How sorry I am that pride and stubbornness kept me away when you needed family the most. Your mother, Sarah, was my daughter, my only child. We had a fight when she was 18, a terrible fight about the man she wanted to marry. Your father, I thought he was no good for her, thought he would drag her down. I told her if she married him, she was no daughter of mine. She married him anyway, and I was too proud to apologize, too proud to reach out, too proud to be the father she needed. When she died, I tried to find you, but the state said you were better off without me. They said I was too old, too set in my ways. They said you needed a real family, not some bitter old man who had already failed one child. Maybe they were right. Maybe I would have failed you too. But I should have tried harder. I should have fought for you. The ranch is yours now. It has been in our family for 3 generations. Your great-grandfather built it with his own hands, and your grandmother loved it more than anything in the world. Your mother grew up there, learned to ride horses in those same fields where I hope you will find some peace. It is not much, but it is yours. It is your birthright and your home, if you want it. I hope you can forgive an old man his mistakes. I hope you can find it in your heart to love this place the way we did. And I hope you know that even though I never got to meet you, I loved you every single day. You are a Patel, Stephen. You belong somewhere. You belong here." I was crying by the time I finished reading. Sitting in a lawyer's office, in a town I had never heard of, crying over words from a man I would never meet. Philip Mitchell handed me a box of tissues and waited patiently while I pulled myself together. The drive to the ranch took 20 minutes through countryside that looked like a painting. Rolling hills covered in golden wheat, red barns scattered across the landscape, horses grazing in green pastures. It was beautiful in a way that made my chest ache. Beautiful in a way that made me understand why people fought to protect places like this. The Patel Ranch sat at the end of a long dirt road, surrounded by white fence posts and ancient oak trees. The house was bigger than I expected, 2 stories with a wraparound porch and dormer windows. It needed work, that was obvious. The paint was peeling, some of the shutters hung crooked, and the yard was overgrown with weeds. But it was solid, built to last, built by people who intended to stay. I walked around the property for an hour before I worked up the courage to go inside. There were outbuildings scattered around the main house, a chicken coop, a tool shed, a grain silo, and the stables. The stables were the biggest building on the property aside from the house, long and low with big sliding doors and windows along both sides. I could see why my grandfather had been proud of this place. It was the kind of property that represented generations of hard work and careful planning. The house was dusty but clean. Someone had been taking care of it, probably Philip Mitchell or maybe a neighbor. The furniture was old but well made. Solid wood tables and chairs, a stone fireplace, braided rugs on hardwood floors. It felt like a home in a way that nowhere else ever had. It felt like the kind of place where families gathered for Sunday dinner and children learned to walk and grandparents told stories about the old days. In the master bedroom, I found a photo album sitting on the dresser. Pictures of people who looked like me. A woman with my eyes and my stubborn chin who had to be my mother. A young couple standing in front of the house when it was new and bright, probably my great-grandparents. And dozens of pictures of the ranch through the years. Horses in the pasture, harvest time in the fields, Christmas mornings in the living room downstairs. I was part of this. These were my people, my history, my legacy. For the first time in my life, I belonged somewhere. That first night, I slept in my grandfather's bed and dreamed about the family I never knew. I woke up determined to make this work, to prove myself worthy of the gift I had been given. I spent the morning exploring every inch of the property, taking inventory of what needed to be fixed and what could be salvaged. The list was long. The roof needed repair, the fence posts were rotting, the fields were overgrown, and most of the farm equipment was rusted beyond use. But the bones were good. The foundation was solid. With enough work and enough time, this place could be beautiful again. I drove into town that afternoon to buy supplies and get a feel for the community. Cedar Falls was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and news traveled fast. By the time I walked into the hardware store, half the town probably knew that Henry Price's mysterious grandson had finally showed up. The woman behind the counter was maybe 60 years old, with gray hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and calloused hands that spoke of hard work. She looked me up and down with sharp eyes, taking my measure. "You must be Stephen," she said. "I am Betty Walker. I knew your grandfather." The way she said it was not exactly friendly, but it was not hostile either. More like she was reserving judgment until she figured out what kind of person I was. I got the feeling that happened a lot in small towns. Newcomers had to prove themselves before they were accepted. "Henry was a good man," she continued. "Stubborn as a mule and twice as ornery, but good. He talked about you all the time, especially toward the end. Worried about whether you would want the ranch, whether you would know what to do with it. I bought basic supplies, hammer, nails, wood stain, work gloves. Betty Walker rang up my purchases and gave me directions to the feed store and the diner. She also mentioned that there were several local men who had worked for my grandfather over the years, who might be willing to help me get the place back in shape if I was serious about staying. The diner was called Millie's, and it was exactly what you would expect from a small-town diner. Red vinyl booths, black and white checkered floor, pie case by the register. The kind of place where farmers gathered for coffee at 5 in the morning, and the waitresses knew everyone's order by heart. I ordered a burger and coffee and listened to the conversations around me. Crop prices, weather predictions, whose daughter was getting married, whose son was shipping out with the military. Normal small-town talk. The kind of conversation I had never been part of, but always wondered about. A man in his 40s slid into the booth across from me without invitation. He was peñonil and lean, with sun-weathered skin and hands that looked like they knew their way around a farm. He introduced himself as Noah Wood, said he had worked for my grandfather for 15 years. Henry was like a father to me, Noah said, taught me everything I know about farming, about treating land with respect. He talked about you constantly, especially after he got sick. Wondered if you would love this place the way he did. We talked for 2 hours. Noah told me about the history of the ranch, about the crops my grandfather had grown, about the horses he had raised. He offered to help me get the place running again, said there were others in town who would pitch in if I was committed to staying. But he also warned me. There were people in Cedar Falls who thought the ranch should have been sold to developers. People who thought a kid from the city, a kid with a record, had no business trying to run a farm. People who would be watching to see if I would fail. I drove back to the ranch that evening, feeling both hopeful and overwhelmed. This was not going to be easy. I knew nothing about farming, nothing about small-town politics, nothing about the kind of life my grandfather had lived. But I wanted to learn. I wanted to prove that I belonged here, that I could honor the legacy I had inherited. That night, I walked out to the stables for the first time. The doors were locked, and I had to search through my grandfather's key ring to find the right one. The lock was stiff, like it had not been opened in months. When I finally got the doors open and flicked on the lights, I understood why. The stables were not being used for horses. They had been converted into some kind of workshop or storage area. There were workbenches along the walls, tools hanging from pegboards, and boxes stacked everywhere. But what caught my attention was the wall at the far end of the building. It was covered with photographs, hundreds of them, all tacked up like some kind of shrine. I walked closer and realized they were pictures of me. School photos from elementary school, candid shots of me walking down streets I recognized, pictures of me at various foster homes and reformatories. Someone had been watching me, documenting my life for years. At the center of the wall was a larger photograph I had never seen before. It was my mother, maybe 17 years old, standing in front of the ranch house with a man I did not recognize. They were both smiling, his arm around her shoulders, her hand resting on her stomach. She was pregnant with me. Below the photograph was a note written in the same shaky handwriting as my grandfather's letter. I found her, it said. I found our boy, but I am too late. I am too old and too sick and too late. God forgive me, I am too late. I stood in that stable for a long time, staring at pictures of a life I never knew I was connected to. Someone had loved me from a distance. Someone had cared enough to track down every detail of my existence, even when they could not be part of it. It was heartbreaking and comforting at the same time. The next morning, I found Noah Wood waiting for me on the front porch with coffee and fresh biscuits from the diner. He took one look at my face and knew I had found something in the stable. Henry spent the last 5 years of his life trying to find you, Noah said. Hired private investigators, called every social services office in 3 states, drove himself half crazy with guilt and regret. When he finally tracked you down, he was already too sick to travel, too sick to fight the system. All he could do was watch from a distance and hope you would survive long enough for him to leave you something. We spent that morning cleaning out the stable, taking down the photographs and packing them carefully in boxes. Some of them I wanted to keep, especially the ones of my mother. Others were too painful to look at. Pictures of me at 7 years old, scared and alone after my first foster placement fell through. Pictures of me at 15, angry and defiant outside the courthouse after my 3rd arrest. But there were good pictures too. Me graduating from the reformatory education program. Me working in the kitchen, actually smiling at something one of the other kids had said. Me reading in the common room, lost in a book. Someone had been proud of those moments. Someone had been cheering for me from the sidelines, even when I did not know they existed. Noah helped me move the workbenches and tools to the barn, and by afternoon the stable was ready for horses again. Not that I had any horses or knew the first thing about caring for them, but it felt important to restore the building to its original purpose, to honor what my grandfather had intended. That evening, I drove into town to have dinner at the diner, and ran into Philip Mitchell. He was sitting alone at the counter, eating meatloaf and reading a newspaper. He invited me to join him, and we talked about the practical aspects of inheriting a ranch. There was money, he explained, not a fortune, but enough to cover basic expenses for a year or two if I was careful. My grandfather had also set up accounts with local suppliers, so I could get seed and fertilizer and equipment on credit until I could prove the farm was viable. But Philip Mitchell also warned me about something Noah had only hinted at. There was a development company that had been pressuring my grandfather to sell the ranch for months before he died. They wanted to build a shopping center and subdivision on the property, and they were not happy that it had been left to someone they saw as an outsider. The company was owned by a man named George Castallo, who also happened to be the mayor of Cedar Falls. The same George Castillo who had been a guard at the reformatory, though Philip Mitchell did not know about that connection. It was a coincidence that made my stomach turn. George Castillo had been one of the few guards who treated us kids with basic human decency, and now he was apparently trying to destroy the one good thing that had ever happened to me. I went back to the ranch that night feeling like I was under siege before the battle had even started. I sat on the front porch with a beer and tried to figure out what I was going to do. I could sell the place, take the money, and disappear. Start over somewhere else, maybe go to college, build a normal life. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing to do. But sitting there looking out over land that had been in my family for 3 generations, I knew I could not walk away. This was the first time in my life I had ever belonged anywhere. The first time I had roots, history, legacy. I was not going to give that up without a fight. The next few weeks fell into a routine. I spent my mornings working on the house, fixing loose boards and painting shutters and clearing weeds from the yard. Afternoons were for learning about farming from Noah and the other local men who stopped by to help. Evenings were for reading my grandfather's journals and trying to understand the business side of running a ranch. The journals were a revelation. My grandfather had been keeping detailed records for decades. What crops grew best in which fields, when to plant and when to harvest, which suppliers were reliable and which ones to avoid. But more than that, the journals were full of his thoughts about the land, about the responsibility that came with owning it, about the legacy he hoped to pass down. He wrote about my mother constantly, about how much he missed her, about the mistakes he had made, about his regret at letting pride keep them apart. He wrote about me too, especially in the later entries, about his desperate search to find me, about his fear that I would reject the ranch the way my mother had rejected him, about his hope that I would understand what this place meant to our family. One entry written just a month before he died hit me particularly hard. "I found Stephen today," he wrote. "My grandson is alive and strong and surviving in a world that has given him nothing but hardship. I am so proud of him and so ashamed of myself. I should have fought harder to bring him home. I should have been the grandfather he deserved. All I can do now is leave him this place and hope it gives him the foundation I never could." 3 weeks after I arrived in Cedar Falls, George Castillo showed up at the ranch. I was in the barn trying to figure out how to repair a broken plow when I heard a car coming up the drive. I walked outside and saw a black sedan pulling up in front of the house. The same George Castillo who had handed me mail at the reformatory stepped out of the driver's seat, wearing a suit instead of a guard uniform. He looked older than I remembered, grayer around the temples, but he had the same steady presence that had made him one of the few adults I trusted during my time at Riverside. He recognized me immediately, and I could see the surprise in his eyes. "Stephen Patel," he said, shaking his head. "I should have put it together when I heard Henry's grandson was coming to claim the ranch. Small world." We talked for a few minutes about my time at Riverside, about how I was adjusting to life in Cedar Falls. George seemed genuinely happy to see me doing well, which made what happened next even more painful. "I have to be honest with you, Stephen," he said. "I am here on business. I represent a development company that has been trying to purchase this property for over a year. We made your grandfather several very generous offers, and I would like to make the same offers to you." He pulled out a folder full of paperwork and spread it on the hood of his car. The numbers were impressive, more money than I had ever imagined having, enough to set me up for life if I was smart about investing it, enough to buy a house anywhere I wanted, go to any college I chose, start any business I could dream of. But George also explained what would happen to the ranch. The development company wanted to build a strip mall and housing subdivision on the property. The house would be torn down, the stables demolished, the fields paved over for parking lots. 3 generations of my family's history would disappear forever. I told him I needed time to think about it, which was true. The money was tempting, especially for someone who had grown up with nothing. But as I watched George drive away, I knew I had already made my decision. This place was not just property to me. It was home. It was family. It was everything I had never had and always wanted. That evening, I called Noah and told him about George's visit. Noah was not surprised. The development pressure that had been building for months, and everyone in town knew it was just a matter of time before someone made a serious push to change the character of Cedar Falls. But Noah also told me something that changed everything. There was a clause in my grandfather's will that I had not fully understood. If I lived on the ranch and worked the land for 1 full year, the property would be protected from development in perpetuity. Some kind of agricultural preservation trust that my grandfather had set up with Philip Mitchell years ago. All I had to do was prove I could make the ranch work. 1 year. 12 months to learn everything my grandfather had spent a lifetime mastering. 12 months to prove I belonged here, to myself and to the community that was still deciding whether to accept me. I spent the next month throwing myself into learning everything I could about farming. I read books, watched videos, pestered Noah and the other local farmers with endless questions. I planted a small vegetable garden behind the house, more for practice than for any real expectation of success. I repaired fence posts and cleaned irrigation ditches and learned to operate equipment that was older than I was. The work was harder than anything I had ever done, but it was also more satisfying. There was something deeply fulfilling about working with your hands, about nurturing something from seed to harvest, about being part of the cycle that fed people and sustained communities. I began to understand why my grandfather had loved this place so much, but I also began to understand the pressure he had been under. George Castillo visited twice more, each time with increasingly generous offers and increasingly urgent warnings about the financial reality of small farming. Other people in town made their opinions known too. Some supported my efforts to restore the ranch, but others made it clear they thought I was in over my head. The worst was a woman named Susan Cooper, who owned the largest real estate agency in Cedar Falls. She cornered me at the diner one evening and launched into a lecture about property values and economic development and the responsibility landowners had to their communities. "You are being selfish," she said. "This town needs jobs and tax revenue, not some kid playing farmer on land that could support dozens of families. Your grandfather was too sentimental to see the bigger picture. But you do not have that excuse." Her words stung because part of me worried she was right. What did I know about farming, about business, about anything that mattered in the real world? I was a 20-year-old ex-convict with no education and no experience trying to run an operation that had taken my grandfather decades to build. But that night, I walked out to the fields and stood in the moonlight looking at the land my great-grandfather had cleared with his own hands. I thought about the photographs in the stable, about all the years my grandfather had spent watching me from a distance and hoping I would find my way home. I thought about the letter he had written, about his belief that I belonged here. I made a decision that night. I was going to make this work, no matter what it took. I was going to prove that Stephen Patel belonged on Patel Ranch, that some things were more important than money, that family and legacy and love of the land still mattered in a world that seemed to value only profit and efficiency. The real test came in early spring when it was time to plant the main crop. Noah had been teaching me about soil preparation and seed selection and timing, but there is a difference between theoretical knowledge and actual betting your future on your ability to get it right. I decided to plant corn on the largest field, the one my grandfather had used for his cash crop for 20 years. It was a conservative choice, something I could sell locally if it grew well, something that would not require too much specialized equipment or knowledge. But it was still a huge risk for someone who had never planted anything more complicated than a tomato plant. The work was backbreaking, preparing the soil, calibrating the planter, walking the rows to check for proper spacing and depth. I worked from dawn to dusk for 2 weeks straight, and by the time I was finished, every muscle in my body ached and my hands were covered with blisters. despite the work gloves. But when the first green shoots started poking through the soil a week later, I felt a pride and satisfaction unlike anything I had ever experienced. I had created something. I had taken raw land and seeds and turned them into the beginning of a harvest. It was a small miracle, and it was mine. The community began to take notice. People who had been skeptical started stopping by to see how the corn was growing, to offer advice about fertilizer and pest control, to share stories about my grandfather and the early days of the ranch. I was slowly being accepted, not as an outsider who had inherited something he did not deserve, but as someone who was willing to work for his place in the community. One of the most important relationships I developed was with an elderly woman named Deborah Gomez, who lived on the neighboring ranch. Deborah had been my grandmother's best friend, and she remembered my mother as a little girl. She became like a surrogate grandmother to me, teaching me about the history of the area and sharing memories of my family that no one else could provide. Deborah also taught me about the social fabric of rural communities, about how neighbors supported each other through difficult times, about the unwritten rules and expectations that govern relationships between farming families. She helped me understand that owning land in a place like Cedar Falls was not just about individual success, but about being part of something larger than yourself. Through Deborah, I met other members of the community who became important mentors and friends. Janet Edwards, who ran the feed store and knew more about animal husbandry than anyone in 3 counties. Lisa Stewart, who managed the farmers market and helped me understand the business side of selling crops. These women took me under their wing and taught me things I never could have learned from books or videos. But the most important relationship I developed was with the land itself. I learned to read the weather signs, to understand the subtle changes in soil color that indicated moisture levels, to recognize the difference between healthy plants and stressed ones. I learned to listen to what the land was telling me, to work with natural cycles instead of fighting against them. By midsummer, my corn was thriving. The stalks were tall and green, the ears were filling out properly, and Noah was predicting a better than average yield for a first-year farmer. I was starting to believe I might actually pull this off, that I might prove myself worthy of the legacy my grandfather had left me. That was when George Castillo made his final offer. He showed up on a Saturday morning in July when the corn was at its peak and the ranch looked better than it had in years. I had spent months repairing and painting and landscaping, and the place was starting to look like the home my grandfather had always envisioned. George brought a team of lawyers and accountants with him this time, and the offer they presented was staggering. 3 times what they had offered before, enough money to set up not just me, but my children and grandchildren for life. They had also done their homework about my background, about the challenges I would face trying to make a living as a small farmer in an increasingly corporate agricultural economy. But what really got my attention was the deadline. They needed an answer by the end of the month because the development company had other properties they were considering if I was not interested in selling. This was my last chance to cash out and start over somewhere else. I spent a week agonizing over the decision. The rational part of my mind knew that farming was a difficult way to make a living, that I was competing against operations with decades of experience and millions of dollars in equipment. The money from the sale could give me opportunities I had never dreamed of, could let me build any kind of life I wanted. But every time I walked through the cornfield or sat on the front porch of the house my great-grandfather had built, I knew I could not sell. This place was not just property to me. It was home. It was family. It was the first place I had ever belonged, and I was not going to give that up for any amount of money. I called George Castillo on a Thursday evening and told him my decision. I was keeping the ranch. I was going to honor the commitment I had made to my grandfather and to myself. I was going to prove that some things were more valuable than money. George was disappointed but not surprised. He wished me luck and warned me that farming was a tough business, especially for someone starting out. But he also said something that stuck with me. He said my grandfather would have been proud of my decision, that Henry had always valued courage and principle over profit. The harvest that fall exceeded everyone's expectations, including my own. The corn yield was excellent, and I was able to sell most of it to a local grain elevator at a good price. More importantly, I had proven to myself and to the community that I could make this work, that I belonged on this land. But the real victory came in November when Philip Mitchell called to tell me that the Agricultural Preservation Trust had been activated. Because I had lived on the ranch and worked the land for the required year, the property was now protected from development forever. No matter what happened in the future, the Patel Ranch would remain farmland. That winter, I used the money from the harvest to make improvements to the house and outbuildings funds. I also started planning for the next year, researching new crops and considering the possibility of raising livestock. Noah introduced me to other young farmers in the region, and I began to see myself as part of a community of people who were committed to preserving agricultural traditions while adapting to modern challenges. I also started dating Lisa Stewart, the woman who managed the farmers market. Lisa was smart and funny and understood the rhythms of rural life in a way that city people never could. She had grown up on a farm herself, and she appreciated what I was trying to accomplish with the ranch. Our relationship developed slowly, built on shared work and common values rather than just attraction. By the spring of my second year, I felt like I had found my place in the world. I was no longer the angry kid who had aged out of the reformatory system. I was Stephen Patel, owner of Patel Ranch, member of the Cedar Falls community, keeper of my family's legacy. I belonged somewhere, and that belonging had changed everything about how I saw myself and my future. The second year brought new challenges and new successes. I diversified the crops, adding soybeans and winter wheat to the rotation. I bought my first livestock, a small herd of cattle that would provide both income and natural fertilizer for the fields. I joined the local farmers association and started participating in community events and decision-making. Most importantly, I started thinking about the future in a way I never had before. Not just my own future, but the future of the ranch, the future of farming in the area, the future of the legacy my grandfather had entrusted to me. I began to understand that owning this land was not just a privilege, but a responsibility to be a good steward, to preserve something valuable for the next generation, to honor the sacrifice and hard work of the people who had come before me. I also started thinking about family in a new way. Not just the family I had lost, but the family I might create. Lisa and I had been talking about marriage, about the possibility of children who would grow up on this land the way my mother had. The idea of continuing the Patel legacy, of raising kids who would learn to love this place the way I had learned to love it, filled me with a sense of purpose and hope I had never experienced. But there was still one piece of unfinished business, one mystery I had never solved. The man I had found hanging in the stable boss on my first day at the ranch. I had never reported his death, partly because I was afraid of the questions it would raise, partly because I was not sure what had really happened. But the image haunted me, and I knew I would never have complete peace until I understood who he was and why he had been there. It was Deborah Gomez who finally helped me solve the mystery. We were sitting on her porch one evening in late summer, watching the sunset over the fields, when I finally worked up the courage to tell her about what I had found in the stable. I described the man, the note he had left, the photographs scattered around his body. Deborah listened without interruption, her face growing more troubled with each detail. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time, rocking slowly in her chair and staring out at the horizon. "That was Thomas Reed," she finally said. "He worked for your grandfather for about 5 years, helped him with the search for you. Thomas was a private investigator, but more than that, he was a friend. He felt responsible when Henry died before you could be found. He blamed himself for not working faster, for not finding you in time for Henry to meet you." Deborah explained that Thomas had been struggling with depression and guilt ever since my grandfather's death. He had continued monitoring me even after the inheritance was settled, watching from a distance to make sure I was safe, to make sure I would claim what was rightfully mine. But he was also tormented by the feeling that he had failed Henry, that he had let down the man who had trusted him to bring his grandson home. The photographs in the stable were Thomas's files, his documentation of the search for me, and his continued surveillance afterward. The note he had left was his apology, his acknowledgement that he could not live with the guilt anymore. He had taken his own life in the place that represented everything he had failed to accomplish in time. Learning the truth about Thomas Reed was both heartbreaking and liberating. Heartbreaking because another person had died, because of the pain and regret that surrounded my family's separation. Liberating because I finally understood that his death was not my fault, that it was the result of guilt and depression that had nothing to do with my arrival at the ranch. I decided to honor Thomas's memory by creating a small memorial in the corner of the property where he was buried. With Philip Mitchell's help, I arranged for a proper funeral and headstone, and I made sure his sacrifice was acknowledged and remembered. Thomas Reed had given his life trying to reunite a family, and that deserved recognition and respect. The memorial service was small but meaningful. Noah was there, and Deborah, and several other community members who had known Thomas during his time working for my grandfather. Lisa stood beside me as we said goodbye to a man who had played a crucial role in bringing me home, even though I had never known him while he was alive. After the service, I felt a sense of closure and peace that had been missing since my first day at the ranch. All the pieces of the puzzle had finally come together. I understood my grandfather's love and regret, my mother's choices and their consequences, Thomas's dedication and ultimate sacrifice. I understood the full story of how I had come to inherit this place and why it mattered so much to so many people. That fall, Lisa and I got engaged. We planned a simple wedding for the following spring to be held right there on the ranch with the whole community invited. It seemed fitting that the place that had given me a family would be where I started a new family of my own. The engagement also prompted me to think more seriously about the future of the ranch and my role as its caretaker. I started working with Philip Mitchell to set up my own agricultural preservation trust, to ensure that the land would remain in farming use even after I was gone. I also began documenting the history of the property, interviewing older community members, and preserving their memories of my grandfather and the early days of the ranch. But most importantly, I started planning for the possibility of children who would grow up on this land. I wanted them to understand their heritage, to appreciate the sacrifices that had been made to preserve this place for them, to feel the same sense of belonging and responsibility that I had discovered here. The third year brought new challenges and new growth. I expanded the livestock operation and added a small orchard on the hillside behind the house. I also started hosting educational tours for school groups, sharing the story of the ranch and teaching kids about sustainable farming practices. It was my way of giving back to the community that had embraced me and of ensuring that the next generation would understand the value of preserving agricultural land. Lisa and I were married in May, surrounded by friends and neighbors who had become like family to us. The ceremony was held in the same field where my grandfather had taught my mother to ride horses, where 3 generations of Patels had worked and loved and dreamed. It was a perfect day, sunny and warm, with the corn already knee-high and the future stretching out before us like an endless green horizon. 5 years have passed since that first terrifying day when I pushed open the rusty gate and discovered the legacy my grandfather had left me. 5 years since I found Thomas Reed in the stable and began to understand the complex web of love and loss and sacrifice that had brought me to this place. The ranch is thriving now. We have diversified into organic vegetables and free-range chickens, and we sell our products at farmers markets throughout the region. Lisa manages the business side of the operation while I focus on production and land management. We have built something sustainable and profitable, something that honors the past while embracing the future. But more than the financial success, we have built a life here, a life rooted in community and tradition and love of the land. We have become part of the fabric of Cedar Falls, contributing to local charities and serving on community boards and hosting events that bring people together. We have found the belonging that I searched for my entire childhood, the sense of home that I never thought I would experience. Last year, Lisa gave birth to our daughter, Sarah, named after my mother. Watching her take her first steps in the same house where my mother learned to walk, seeing her discover the world through the same windows that framed my grandfather's view of his beloved land, fills me with a sense of continuity that I struggle to put into words. Sarah will grow up knowing where she comes from, knowing the stories of the people who came before her, knowing that she belongs to something larger than herself. She will learn to ride horses in the same fields where her great-grandmother played, and she will understand that this land is not just property, but heritage, not just a place to live, but a legacy to preserve and protect. I often think about the path that brought me here, about all the seemingly random events that had to align perfectly for me to end up standing on this porch, looking out over fields that bear my family name. If my grandfather had died a year earlier, before he found me, if Thomas Reed had not been so dedicated to his search, if I had been released from the reformatory a month later, after the deadline for claiming the inheritance had passed, if George Castillo's development company had made their final offer before I had time to fall in love with this place, any one of those things could have changed everything. I could still be drifting from city to city, working dead-end jobs and wondering if I would ever find a place where I belonged. Instead, I am Stephen Patel of Patel Ranch, husband to Lisa, father to Sarah, keeper of a legacy that stretches back 3 generations and forward into a future I am helping to create. The anger that defined my youth has been replaced by gratitude and purpose. The loneliness that haunted my childhood has been healed by love and community. The sense of not belonging anywhere has been transformed into deep roots and unshakable identity. I know who I am now, and I know where I come from, and I know what I am meant to do with my life. Sometimes I walk out to the memorial we built for Thomas Reed and tell him about the ranch, about how well the crops are growing, about Sarah's first words and Lisa's latest business idea. I tell him that his sacrifice was not in vain, that he succeeded in bringing me home, even though he did not live to see it. I tell him that Henry would be proud of what we have built here, proud of the way the community has embraced us, proud of the future we are creating for the next generation. But mostly, I just say thank you. Thank you for never giving up on the search. Thank you for believing that I deserve to know where I came from. Thank you for understanding that some things are more important than money or convenience or the easy path. Thank you for helping me find my way home. The ranch continues to evolve and grow. We are planning to add a farm stand next year, and we are exploring the possibility of agritourism as a way to share our story with visitors from the city. We want people to understand what we have learned, that there is value in preserving agricultural land, that there is wisdom in traditional ways of life, that there is healing and connection to the earth and to community. Now, as I sit on this same porch where I first read my grandfather's letter, watching Sarah play in the yard where my mother once played, I am overwhelmed by the magnitude of what has been given to me. Not just land or money or material security, but identity, purpose, belonging, family. All the things I thought were lost forever when my mother died and I entered the system as a scared 7-year-old boy. I think about all the kids who are still in that system, still bouncing between foster homes and institutions, still believing that they are alone in the world and that no one cares whether they succeed or fail. I think about the anger and hopelessness I carried for so many years, and I wish I could go back and tell my younger self that it was all leading somewhere, that there was a purpose to the pain, that someone was searching for me even when I had given up hope of ever being found. That is why I am sharing this story with you. Because I want you to know that family is not always about blood relations or legal documents or traditional definitions. Sometimes family is about the people who choose to love you, the communities that choose to embrace you, the mentors who choose to invest in your success. Sometimes family is about the legacy you inherit, but more often it is about the legacy you create. I want you to know that belonging is possible, even for those of us who started life feeling like we did not fit anywhere. That home is not just a place you are born into, but a place you can build through hard work and commitment and love. That it is never too late to change the trajectory of your life, to choose hope over despair, to choose connection over isolation. The ranch has taught me that we are all part of something larger than ourselves. We are part of the land that sustains us, the communities that support us, the families that shape us, and the legacies we leave behind. We are part of a story that began long before we were born and will continue long after we are gone. Our job is to play our part with courage and integrity and love, to honor what we have been given, and to leave something valuable for those who come after us. If you are watching this and you feel lost or alone or like you do not belong anywhere, I want you to know that your story is not over. There are people searching for you, communities waiting to embrace you, purposes waiting to be discovered. There are ranches and farms and businesses and families and movements that need exactly what you have to offer. There is a place where you belong, even if you have not found it yet. Before I finish, I want to ask you something. Tell me in the comments where you are watching this from and what home means to you. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message, someone who might be struggling to find their place in the world. Let us build a community of people who understand that belonging is not about where you start, but about where you choose to put down roots. Subscribe if this story moved you, because there are more stories like this one. Stories about people who found family in unexpected places, who built legacies from nothing, who discovered that love and community and purpose are always possible, no matter how dark the beginning of the story might be. My name is Stephen Patel, and this is my home, this is my family, this is my legacy. And if a kid from the reformatory can find his way to a place like this, then anyone can find their way home. You just have to be willing to push open the gate, even when your hands are shaking, even when you are scared of what you might find on the other side. Sometimes the most beautiful destinations are reached through the most difficult journeys. Sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as the hardest challenges. And sometimes, if you are very lucky, you discover that you were never really alone after all. You were just waiting for the right moment, the right place, the right people to show you where you belonged all along.